Town kids couldn't believe ice cream without a freezer on old farms. The summer of 1892 brought sweltering heat across the American heartland, and in a small farming community outside Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a group of town children were about to witness something that would challenge everything they understood about how the world worked. These weren't farm kids, mind you. These were the children of shopkeepers and clerks, kids who'd grown up with the convenience of the icebox that sat in their kitchen corners, filled weekly by the iceman who made his rounds through town. They thought they knew how things worked. They thought ice cream required ice houses and freezers. They were about to learn that America's farm families had been creating frozen delights long before modern convenience ever reached the countryside. The Henderson farm sat 3 miles outside of town, a sprawling operation of dairy cows, chicken coops, and vegetable gardens that seemed to produce abundance from nothing more than hard work and know-how passed down through generations. When Martha Henderson invited the town children out for her daughter Sarah's birthday celebration, their parents saw it as a charitable gesture, a chance for their children to see how the other half lived. What those town kids discovered that day would become the talk of the community for years to come, a testament to the ingenuity that defined American farm life, in an era when making do wasn't just a saying, but a way of survival. Young Timothy Morrison, the banker's son, arrived in his Sunday best, already complaining about the heat before he'd even stepped down from his father's carriage. His sister Elizabeth clutched a store-bought gift, wrapped in paper that had cost more than most farm families spent on groceries in a week. They expected a simple afternoon, perhaps some games in the yard, maybe a slice of cake if the farm family could afford such luxuries. What they didn't expect was to see Sarah's older brother James emerge from the spring house, carrying a wooden bucket filled with something that looked impossibly like ice cream, frozen solid, despite the fact that the mercury had climbed past 90 degrees, and there wasn't an ice house anywhere on the property. The science behind what happened in that spring house that day wasn't magic, although it might as well have been to those wide-eyed town children. It was chemistry, pure and simple, the kind of practical chemistry that American farmers had perfected through trial and error, through necessity being the mother of invention, through the simple fact that when you lived miles from town and couldn't afford luxuries, you learned to create your own small miracles. The Henderson family, like thousands of farm families across America, had mastered the art of ice cream making using nothing more than salt, ice harvested from their farm pond during the previous winter, and an understanding of thermodynamics that they'd never call by such a fancy name, but could execute with precision that would make a chemist proud. The process began months earlier, back in January when the farm pond froze solid under the weight of a brutal winter cold snap. While town families purchased their ice from commercial operations, farm families harvested their own, cutting thick blocks from pond surfaces using specialized saws that had been in families for generations. These blocks, some weighing upward of 100 pounds, were hauled to ice houses built partially underground, structures designed with double walls filled with sawdust insulation that would keep ice frozen well into the following autumn if done correctly. The Henderson's ice house, built by Sarah's grandfather in 1867, still held nearly half its original load by summer's end each year, a testament to construction techniques developed over decades of American agricultural innovation. But having ice wasn't enough to make ice cream. That's where the salt came in, and this is where the chemistry turned into something resembling magic for anyone who didn't understand the principles at work. When Martha Henderson packed that wooden ice cream churn with layers of ice and rock salt, she was creating a brine solution that could achieve temperatures far below the freezing point of pure water. Salt lowers the freezing point of water through a process called freezing point depression. The ice begins to melt, but as it does, it absorbs heat from its surroundings, including the metal canister sitting in the center of that wooden bucket. That canister, filled with cream, sugar, eggs and vanilla, would drop in temperature to around 15 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze the mixture into ice cream within 30 to 40 minutes of steady cranking. Timothy Morrison watched in disbelief as James Henderson explained this process, his words simple but his knowledge profound. The boy had probably never set foot in a formal chemistry classroom, yet he understood molecular principles that Timothy's expensive private tutor had barely touched upon. This was the education of necessity, the kind of learning that happened when entertainment was scarce and curiosity was encouraged, when children worked alongside their parents and absorbed knowledge through participation rather than memorization. Young James could explain how the constant stirring prevented large ice crystals from forming, how the dasher inside that canister created a smooth texture by incorporating air into the mixture, how the addition of egg yolks created a custard base that gave the final product a richer, creamier consistency than anything you could buy in town. The town children took turns cranking the handle, their soft hands unused to the work that grew harder as the mixture began to freeze and resistance increased. Farm children like Sarah and James could crank for 30 minutes without breaking a sweat, their arms strong from daily chores that involved carrying water buckets, forking hay, and handling tools that would seem impossibly heavy to their town counterparts. But there was no judgment in their eyes as they watched Timothy struggle after just 5 minutes of cranking. Instead, Sarah simply took over, her steady rhythm never faltering, while James explained the importance of maintaining consistent speed to ensure even freezing throughout the mixture. The ingredients themselves told a story of farm abundance that town families rarely considered. The cream came from the Hendersons' own dairy cows, separated that very morning using a hand-cranked separator that divided whole milk into cream and skim milk with mechanical precision. The eggs came from free-ranging chickens that produced yolks so golden they looked almost orange, a result of their varied diet of insects, greens, and kitchen scraps. The vanilla was one of the few purchased ingredients, ordered from a catalog, and used sparingly because it represented real money, cash that had to come from selling butter or eggs in town. The sugar, too, was purchased, though some farm families had learned to make do with honey or sorghum syrup when money was particularly tight. What amazed the town children most wasn't just that the Hendersons could make ice cream without a modern freezer. It was the abundance of variations they created using nothing but farm products and wild ingredients gathered from their own land. Martha Henderson kept a small notebook filled with recipes she'd collected over the years, variations on the basic ice cream formula that transformed simple ingredients into sophisticated desserts that wouldn't have been out of place in the finest restaurants of Philadelphia or New York. There was strawberry ice cream made from berries grown in their own patch, picked at dawn when they were sweetest and crushed with just enough sugar to bring out their natural flavor. There was peach ice cream that captured the essence of summer in every spoonful, made from fruit so ripe and sweet that it hardly needed additional sugar at all. In the fall, the Hendersons made pumpkin ice cream, roasting the pumpkin first to concentrate its flavor, then mixing the puree with cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger from Martha's spice cabinet. They made maple walnut ice cream using syrup they'd tapped from their own trees each spring, boiling down gallons of sap into concentrated sweetness that carried the taste of the land itself. They made blackberry ice cream from wild berries gathered along the fence rows, the seeds left in because removing them was considered wasteful, and besides, those little crunchy bits added texture that made the treat more interesting. They even made corn ice cream, believe it or not, scraping fresh sweet corn kernels off the cob, simmering them in cream to infuse the flavor, then straining out the kernels before freezing the mixture into something surprisingly delicious that tasted like summer itself. The Henderson children understood something that their town counterparts had never considered. Luxury wasn't about having access to stores and commercial products. Real luxury was having the knowledge and resources to create abundance from the land around you. While Timothy Morrison's family bought their ice cream from the confectionery in town, paying premium prices for mass-produced desserts that all tasted vaguely similar, the Henderson family could create a dozen different flavors from ingredients that cost them nothing but time and effort. This was the wealth of American farm life that outsiders rarely understood, the kind of richness that didn't show up in bank accounts, but manifested in laden tables, full root cellars, and the ability to create special treats whenever the occasion called for it. The technique for making ice cream on farms spread across America throughout the 19th century, evolving from simple hand-cranked methods to more sophisticated approaches that demonstrated the mechanical ingenuity of rural Americans. The Nancy Johnson hand-crank ice cream maker, patented in 1843, revolutionized home ice cream production by introducing a dasher mechanism that scraped frozen cream from the sides of the canister, while simultaneously incorporating air into the mixture. Before this invention, making ice cream required constant manual stirring in a pot-in-pot arrangement that took hours and produced inconsistent results. Johnson's design, which she sold for just $200 because she needed money more than she needed patent rights, would eventually make millions for the manufacturers who bought her patent and mass-produced the machines that found their way onto farms across America. But having a good ice cream maker wasn't enough. You needed ice, and for farm families who couldn't afford to purchase ice commercially, that meant ice harvesting became a crucial winter task that provided for summer comfort months later. The process of ice harvesting on American farms was a community affair, much like barn raising or wheat threshing, an event that brought neighbors together for hard work, followed by fellowship and shared meals. When the farm pond froze to a thickness of at least 8 inches, usually sometime in January or February depending on the region, families would gather with specialized tools that had been developed specifically for this purpose. The ice saw was the most important tool, a long blade with large teeth designed to cut through frozen water without binding or breaking. A skilled ice cutter could score the surface in a grid pattern, creating uniform blocks that were easier to handle and stacked more efficiently in the ice house. The ice tongs, with their sharp points and spreading handles, allowed workers to grip and lift blocks that were too slippery to hold by hand. The ice pick was used for breaking apart blocks that froze together and for creating drainage channels that prevented water from pooling on the cutting surface. Together, these tools transformed a frozen pond into a winter harvest as important as any crop grown in summer. The work was brutally cold and surprisingly dangerous. Men worked in teams, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, their hands protected by thick gloves that still couldn't completely shield against the cold that seeped through after hours of handling ice. Feet had to be watched carefully on the slippery surface, and more than one ice harvester over the years had fallen through thin spots or broken sections, plunging into water cold enough to kill within minutes if rescue didn't come quickly. But American farm families understood risk, understood that comfort and survival often required accepting danger as part of the bargain. They worked carefully, tested the ice thickness regularly, kept ropes and planks nearby for emergencies, and got the job done because it needed doing. The ice house itself represented another example of American farm ingenuity, a structure designed using principles that modern engineers would recognize as sound thermodynamics, despite being developed by men who'd never seen the inside of a physics classroom. The typical farm ice house was built partially underground, using the Earth's natural insulation to maintain stable, cool temperatures. The walls were constructed with a double layer, creating a cavity that was filled with sawdust, a waste product from lumber mills that proved to be one of the best natural insulators available. The roof was heavily insulated as well, since heat rises and the top of the ice house was the most vulnerable point for temperature gain. Inside, the ice blocks were stacked with precision, again using sawdust as insulation between layers and around the edges. The amount of sawdust used was critical. Too little, and the ice would melt too quickly, too much, and it became difficult to retrieve blocks when needed. Experienced farmers developed an eye for the right ratio, knowledge passed down through generations that couldn't be found in any book, but was essential for success. Drainage was another crucial consideration. As ice slowly melted throughout the summer, the water had to go somewhere. So ice houses were built with drainage systems that channeled water away from the structure, preventing it from pooling and causing premature melting of the remaining ice. A well-built and well-managed ice house could keep ice frozen from January harvest all the way through October, providing 10 months of refrigeration that gave farm families food preservation options that would have been impossible otherwise. This ice wasn't just used for making ice cream, though that was certainly one of the more enjoyable applications. It was used to cool milk to prevent spoilage, to preserve meat during summer butchering, to keep butter firm during transport to market, and to provide relief during illness when fever needed to be brought down. The ice house was as essential to farm operation as the barn or the root cellar, a piece of infrastructure that required significant labor to fill but paid dividends throughout the year. Back at the Henderson farm that summer afternoon in 1892, the ice cream was finally ready. Martha Henderson removed the dasher from the canister, scraping off the frozen cream that clung to it. a treat that by tradition went to whoever had done the cranking. Sarah licked the dasher clean, while her mother packed the ice cream down, covered it with a cloth and buried the canister back in the ice and salt mixture to harden further, while the children played games in the yard. This final hardening period was important, allowing the ice cream to firm up from a soft-serve consistency to the scoopable frozen dessert that everyone anticipated. When Martha finally served the ice cream an hour later, presented in simple crockery bowls that had been chilled in the springhouse, the town children experienced something they'd never forget. This wasn't the slightly gritty, overly sweet commercial ice cream they bought in town. This was velvet smooth, rich with real cream and fresh eggs, flavored with vanilla that hadn't been sitting on a shelf for months, but had been carefully rationed from a bottle that Martha treated like liquid gold. The taste was unlike anything they'd experienced, proof that the best things in life weren't necessarily the most expensive or convenient, but rather those made with care, using quality ingredients and time-tested techniques. Timothy Morrison asked if he could take some ice cream home, a request that made the Henderson children exchange knowing glances. Town kids always wanted to take things home, as if experience could be packaged and transported, as if the magic of farm life could be bottled up and carried back to their organized streets and scheduled lives. Martha kindly explained that ice cream didn't travel well, that it would melt long before his father's carriage reached town, that some pleasures were meant to be enjoyed in the moment they were created. It was a gentle lesson in impermanence, in being present, in understanding that not everything could be possessed and stored away for later convenience. The tradition of farm ice cream socials emerged from this same culture of ice cream making, becoming a cornerstone of rural American social life throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These gatherings, typically held on Sunday afternoons during summer months, brought entire farming communities together for fellowship, courtship, and the simple pleasure of enjoying frozen treats during the hottest months of the year. The host family would provide the ice and basic ingredients, while guests might bring fruit, extra cream, or other additions to create variety. Young men took turns cranking the ice cream makers, a task that allowed them to demonstrate strength and stamina to the young women watching from nearby, who would fan themselves and pretend not to notice the show being put on for their benefit. These socials served purposes beyond entertainment. They strengthened community bonds that were essential for survival in rural America, where neighbors depended on each other for help during harvest, for assistance during medical emergencies, for companionship during long winters when social opportunities were scarce. They provided approved settings for courtship in an era when young people's interactions were carefully monitored and chaperoned. They offered rare opportunities for women to socialize outside their own families, sharing recipes and techniques and gossip that helped bind the community together. And they created memories that lasted lifetimes, the kind of simple pleasures that people would remember decades later, with a nostalgia that perhaps glossed over the hard work involved, but captured something essential about what it meant to belong to a place and a community. The decline of farm ice cream making began in the early 20th century as rural electrification gradually reached American farms, bringing with it the electric freezer that eliminated the need for ice houses and hand cranking. The first electric refrigerators appeared in urban homes around 1913, but it would be decades before they became common in rural areas where electricity itself was still a novelty. The Rural Electrification Administration, established in 1935 as part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, finally brought power to America's farms on a large scale, transforming rural life in ways both obvious and subtle. With electricity came convenience, but something was lost in the translation. The electric ice cream maker eliminated the cranking, the careful attention to ice and salt ratios, the gathering of family members to take turns at the handle. Push a button, wait 30 minutes, and you had ice cream. It worked, certainly, but the process lost its character, its requirement for participation and patience. The modern freezer eliminated the need for ice houses entirely, which meant one less winter chore, but also one less reason for communities to gather for ice harvest, one less skill to pass down to children, one less connection to the seasonal rhythms that had defined farm life for generations. Today, the art of making ice cream with hand-cranked churns and harvested ice has largely disappeared from American life, relegated to historical demonstrations and nostalgia-driven summer camps where children get a taste of how their great-great-grandparents lived. The old ice houses, those ingeniously designed structures that once dotted farm properties across the nation, have mostly collapsed or been torn down, their purpose forgotten by generations that have never known life without electric refrigeration. The knowledge of proper ice harvesting, of sawdust ratios, of the perfect consistency of salt and ice for optimal freezing, survives mainly in historical societies and among the dedicated few who keep old skills alive as a hobby rather than necessity. But there's something worth remembering in these old practices, something beyond mere nostalgia for simpler times that probably weren't as simple as we like to imagine. The farm families who made ice cream without freezers, who created luxury from basic ingredients and hard work, who turned summer gatherings into memories that lasted lifetimes, understood something profound about self-reliance and community and the satisfaction that comes from creating rather than simply consuming. They knew that the best flavors came from fresh ingredients used at their peak. They understood that anticipation enhanced enjoyment, that treats were more special when they required effort, that convenience wasn't always an improvement over tradition. When young Timothy Morrison returned home that evening in the summer of 1892, his mother asked him about his day at the farm. He struggled to explain what he'd witnessed, how the Henderson family had created something wonderful using nothing but ice from their pond, cream from their cows, and knowledge passed down through generations. His mother smiled and told him it was nice that he'd had a good time, but he could see she didn't really understand. How could she? She'd grown up in town, had always bought her ice cream from shops, had never needed to understand the science and art that went into creating frozen desserts before modern convenience made such knowledge unnecessary. But Timothy never forgot that afternoon. Years later, when he inherited his father's bank and found himself financing loans for farm families, weathering the agricultural depressions of the early 20th century, he would remember the Henderson family and their ice cream, their abundance that didn't show up in financial statements, but was real nonetheless. He would remember that wealth came in many forms, that knowledge and skill were assets as valuable as land or equipment, that communities built on mutual dependence and shared experiences were stronger than those built on convenience and isolation. The story of ice cream on American farms is really the story of American ingenuity itself, the ability to identify a want or need and figure out how to meet it using available resources and accumulated knowledge. It's about understanding that limitations can inspire creativity rather than prevent it, that the absence of modern convenience forces us to engage more deeply with process and purpose. It's about communities that worked together and celebrated together, that understood pleasure as something created rather than purchased, that found joy in simple things made extraordinary through care and craftsmanship. Those old techniques for making ice cream without freezers represented more than just a method for creating frozen desserts. They represented an entire world view, a way of living that emphasized self-reliance without rugged individualism, that valued community without sacrificing independence, that found richness in simplicity and satisfaction in work well done. When we look back at these practices now, with our modern freezers and electric conveniences, we might be tempted to dismiss them as quaint relics of a harder time. But perhaps what we're really seeing is evidence of a different kind of sophistication, one that modern life with all its convenience has caused us to forget. The spring house where the Hendersons kept their milk and butter cool, the ice house that held winter's harvest through summer's heat, the wooden churn that required strong arms and patient cranking. These weren't primitive tools used by people who didn't know better. They were appropriate technologies developed by people who understood their environment intimately, who observed and experimented and refined their methods over generations, who created systems that worked reliably without requiring fossil fuels or electric grids or supply chains stretching across continents. There's wisdom in that. Wisdom that perhaps we've discarded too quickly in our rush toward ever more convenient living. The town kids who visited the Henderson farm that summer day in 1892 received an education that no school could provide. They learned that their assumptions about how things worked were limited by their experience, that knowledge existed beyond textbooks and formal instruction, that different didn't mean inferior. They learned that treats were sweeter when they required effort, that anticipation enhanced enjoyment, that participating in creation was more satisfying than passive consumption. They learned, perhaps most importantly, that the world was more complex and interesting than they'd imagined, that people they might have dismissed as simple country folk possessed sophisticated understanding that deserved respect rather than condescension. And maybe that's the real lesson we can take from the story of ice cream on old American farms, one that remains relevant even in our modern age of instant gratification and constant convenience. The ability to create rather than merely consume, to understand process rather than just outcome, to appreciate that good things often require time and effort and knowledge, these remain valuable regardless of what century we live in. The farm families who made ice cream without freezers weren't somehow superior to us, but they possessed knowledge and skills that connected them to their environment and their community in ways that many of us have lost. When Martha Henderson served ice cream to those town children on that hot summer afternoon, she wasn't showing off or proving a point. She was simply doing what farm families had always done, creating abundance from available resources, making special occasions memorable through care and effort, demonstrating that joy didn't require wealth, but rather creativity and knowledge and willingness to work. That wooden churn would be cranked countless more times over the years, would serve at dozens more birthday parties and ice cream socials and Sunday afternoon gatherings. It would eventually be passed down to Sarah when she married and started her own family, would become an heirloom, carrying not just monetary value, but the accumulated memories of generations gathered around to take turns cranking, to sample the results, to create together something that couldn't be bought in any store. The techniques for making ice cream without modern freezers survive now mainly as curiosity, practiced by historical reenactors and nostalgic hobbyists and summer camp counselors teaching children about how life used to be. But the principles behind those techniques remain as sound as ever, the chemistry of freezing point depression unchanged by the passage of time, the satisfaction of creating something with your own hands still as real as it was in 1892. Perhaps there's value in remembering these old methods, not because we should abandon our modern conveniences, but because understanding how things used to be done helps us appreciate both how far we've come and what we might have lost along the way. The story of ice cream on American farms reminds us that human ingenuity finds its fullest expression not in having unlimited resources, but in making the most of what's available. Those farm families who harvested ice in winter stored it through summer, mixed it with salt and cream and sugar to create frozen treats that delighted children and adults alike. They were scientists and artists and engineers, even if they never claimed those titles. They were Americans in the truest sense, people who saw problems as challenges to be solved rather than obstacles to be feared, who valued knowledge and skill and community, who understood that the best life wasn't necessarily the easiest life, but the one lived with purpose and connection, and the satisfaction that comes from creating rather than just consuming. So the next time you pull a carton of ice cream from your freezer, take a moment to appreciate not just the convenience, but also the long history of human ingenuity that led to that convenience. Remember the farm families who made frozen desserts using winter ice and summer cream, who turned cranking a wooden churn into a social occasion, who created luxury from basic ingredients and hard work. Remember that convenience, while valuable, isn't the only measure of progress, that something important lived in those old practices that required skill and effort and community. Remember that the town kids who couldn't believe ice cream without a freezer were witnessing not just a neat trick, but an entire way of life, one that valued self-reliance and knowledge and the kind of richness that doesn't show up in store windows, but lives in strong communities and accumulated wisdom, and the satisfaction of creating something wonderful with your own hands. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed learning about how our ancestors made ice cream without modern freezers, please subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from America's agricultural past. Give us a thumbs up and share this video with anyone who appreciates the ingenuity and resourcefulness of early American farm families. This video is inspired by real historical events and practices and is not intended to represent or offend any individuals. Until next time, keep exploring the forgotten knowledge that made America great.